Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
This is September 2nd, 2020, and we're on episode 87 of Transmission.
We're closing in on that big triple-digit number.
100.
I'm very excited about that.
We're going to have to, we've talked about this before, but we have to make sure we have a really special episode.
Isn't every episode a really special episode?
Especially.
Especially. Maybe that'll be the episode we'll reveal our cool little intro.
Maybe.
That would make it special.
My mom used to say I was especially special.
There you go.
Kidding. She never said that. For those who are new, I'm Mark Van Steenwyk. I'm the director for the Center for Prophetic Imagination.
I'm Daniel Wolpert. I direct MICA, the Minnesota Institute of Contemplation and Healing.
And for a sense of context, I'm exactly a mile south almost of the U.S. Bank Stadium in Minneapolis, and Dan is another mile south of me. So we're in South Minneapolis.
There you go.
Just a mile apart from each other.
Yes. And we're in the middle of a series. We're doing our first series. It's a 3-part series, just like kind of having a 3-point sermon.
Yes.
Although, as one of my homiletics professors said, I don't care if a sermon has 3 points or 5 points or 7 points. It just has to have a point.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that was pretty good.
Yeah.
All right. So this is a 3-part series on the left.
So yesterday we had a conversation of what is the left. I mean, there are entire tomes and volumes written on that. And so we just gave a thumbnail sketch. And today we're talking about spirituality in the left because it came up recently, and it comes up often. So
yeah. So I think that there are a lot of kind of popular tropes, I would say, about spirituality in the left. I would say the 2 biggest ones that at least I hear are, one, the famous godless communism comment, right? Mm-hmm. So that the left, the communist left, is highly atheist in nature and rejects God and religion.
Yep.
And then 2, you have the kind of radical spiritual left, Catholic worker types, people who maybe are on the margins of what we think of as mainstream religion, but are people who nonetheless embrace religion as a part of their leftist activity.
Mm-hmm.
So, as with many of these kind of lines or dichotomies, and that's often something that we don't want to appreciate.
Well, it gets super common, like even within the Catholic worker, if you go to Catholic workers things, which I do from time to time,
right,
amongst them, to the mainline, to the Catholic Church, they're all like the fringe, but amongst themselves, they're like, well, there's a line between people who are generally more progressive and more radical, along all these sorts of lines. Like, where do you tip over from liberalism into radicalism is an issue, and then also like how you relate to that institutional body of the church. So in the Catholic worker world, it's fascinating. There are Facebook pages about the Catholic worker that I'll go to, and it's hyper-conservative Catholics who happen to be pacifists. And then if I show up, who I legitimately think I am of being a Catholic worker, they're like, you can't shut up, you're not even Catholic. But then you go to any Catholic worker, and like half the people in any given Catholic worker are actually Catholic. And so it's murky, and that's just one little snippet of a larger system. Right. And so it also gets complicated. It's hard for leftist thinking at all to fit well with traditional dominant forms of spirituality. And anyone who says otherwise, I think, is trying to trick themselves. But it's to say that somehow leftism leads towards an atheistic framework is a bit of an overstatement.
Yes. And Gus is making fun of us already.
90-minute 3-point sermon. That sounds rough. Clearly, need to go to more Pentecostal churches.
Yes.
It'll
Yes.
build up your tolerance.
See. So there's a good example of a leftist dissing religion already.
Yeah. Why do you hate Jesus so much, Gus? Wouldn't you want 90 minutes of pure nectar about our Lord? For just to bring these in, no gods, no masters except Jesus. Yeah. I mean, that's the thing. No gods, no masters is a sort of anarchist dictum. No gods, no masters, no bosses, no landlords, none of the hierarchical powers. But if you're a Christian anarchist, which is something I know some things about.
I was going to say, do you know any Christian anarchists?
I wonder if I know anyone who's written books about it.
I know.
But that's always the trick. So this is a perfect example of no gods, no masters. That makes a lot of sense if you are in a context where the church has almost entirely, in its dominant and organizational expressions, been a part of oppression. So you reject that along with any other authority system. But what if you're a person of faith? So can you say no gods, no masters? So a lot of Christian anarchists are like, no gods, no masters. Well, but Jesus, we follow him somehow, but in a different way. Or,
so I think that's just like we had to delve into the history of what is the left a little bit. I think we also need to delve a little bit into the history of religion and spirituality as these things develop together, right? Because yes, if the critique by the left, which again is trying to overthrow oppressive power, what it perceives to be oppressive social power, if that's the goal of the left, and religion, and especially state religion, is part of oppressive power, then of course you're not going to be in favor of that. I mean, it just is very logical. I mean, if the cross is coming along with the sword and the flag, then leftists are going to have a problem with that form of religion. And in the world that European leftism was developing, that was also the world in which you'd had the Reformation. You were having all this religious upheaval. You were having people questioning religion altogether, questioning the authority of the Bible, questioning how the Bible was created. And so, it really makes sense that a big part of leftist thought and reflection would be whatever spirituality we're going to have, we don't want it to be an oppressive state church or even an oppressive local church. And so in some ways that to me is just sort of logical kind of thinking.
Well, to me, if we're talking within Western Christianity, which I don't have a strong knowledge of things outside the West because I'm a white American who went to an evangelical seminary. But there is this, you see, like in the Middle Ages, they were radical movements. We couldn't call them left because that'd be anachronistic, which would often jump over authority systems to make a direct appeal to God. And so that comes from we're talking before, and the Beguines were seen as threatening, even though they maybe weren't militant, because they said, well, we don't need to be mediated through the church. We're going to set up our own religious orders that aren't even going to have a formal rule, so that you can't sanction or unsanction it. And we're going to deal directly with God. A lot of the mystics were like that. You have apocalyptic movements. A lot of the early Anabaptists trying to usher in the kingdom of God. You had the Franciscan kind of spin-off movements, like Fraticelli, who were trying to say, well, if we take Franciscan spirituality to its logical conclusion, we have to overthrow the kings and the princes. And so this was still rooted in a deeply spiritual way of understanding the world that rejected the gatekeepers of spirituality. But when you go through the Enlightenment, when people are starting to question the idea of God, and all of a sudden people start thinking, well, maybe this whole idea of some sort of autarch living in heaven is the fundamental origin of this sort of oppression. And so let's just get rid of the whole thing. It makes a lot of sense. And so it leaves you with a problem. Going back to, there's some comments here.
Yeah, we got a lot of comments going on.
It frames the question as within Christianity in particular. If you believe in some sort of spiritual reality that's greater than the sum of physical existence, you believe in God in some way. You either have, but you know that belief in God contributes in some way to oppression. You either have to get rid of God, or you have to radically re-envision what does it mean. And how can you have a fundamentally anti-authoritarian understanding of God, which is the way I've gone. So comments like,
right. And
go ahead. You say something.
Well, yeah. And in a lot of ways, what you're describing is summarized around the issue of power, right?
Yeah.
So where is power coming from and who has power? So in the same way that, the left would talk about the power should be with the people, right? And however you organize that, with religion and spirituality, there's this question of, are we talking about power over, right? This big guy in heaven beating on all of us. Or are you talking about power with and power from the spirit of the people? And so yeah, I mean, the spirituality of the left is not going to tend to want to be that power over. You're either going to reject that completely, and then sometimes it gets replaced by the power of the state, and you run into all kinds of problems there. But you're either going to reject it completely, or you're going to envision some sort of spirituality where power is in the midst of the people.
Yep. Just to blaze through some comments.
Yeah.
Ford asked, is capitalism the only distinguishing factor between liberals and leftists? We talked about that a little bit yesterday. I think it's a distinguishing factor. Yeah. It's more complex than that. But if you're wanting to reform capitalism to make it a little bit better as your ultimate goal, that makes you a liberal. A leftist is when you're saying to hell with capitalism altogether. It's fair to say that can be a distinguishing factor, but it's not the only one. Thanks for reading my book, Ford. The book he's referring to is That Holy Anarchist. There's also a book called Unkingdom. Both talk about Christian anarchism, although I don't know if I'm an orthodox Christian anarchist. Just fair warning.
Just sort of an oxymoron. Really.
Well, to me, it's the true spirit of anarchism, baby. Adam writes, wouldn't Jesus have been anarchist? It's more that you're riding with Jesus than he's ruling you. I think that's fairly accurate. I think he's at least akin to anarchism, or a precursor.
Yeah.
It depends on what you mean by anarchism, but he definitely has this, not just anti-authoritarianism, but a radically reforming of what authority means that comes from that bubbles up rather than comes top down. And so there's definitely something anarchic about Jesus for sure. Mm-hmm. And I don't think he rules me. That's the other thing. I don't think my fundamental relationship with Jesus is one of obedience. Jesus is my ride or die. That's what Ford says. Adam responds, to be fair, Jesus is your ride and die. Good theology there, Adam. Mark writes, do you believe it is fair to say that aspects of liberation theology is a doorway into spirituality for the left?
Yeah.
Incredibly, yes. Like, I cannot conceive of a viable spirituality for leftists that doesn't in some ways embrace or account for liberation theology, which for those listening, liberation theology is basically the starting point. Not that as Christians or religious people we need to care about oppression, but that somehow there's a unique way in which we cannot experience the presence of God apart from encountering solidarity with the oppressed. So it's a deep thing.
So liberation theology, is a term referring to a development mostly coming out of Latin America originally, but now very much spread across the world. That began to read the Bible from the eyes of the poor and the oppressed. And this phrase that you'll sometimes hear that, God has a preferential option for the poor.
Yeah.
And this notion that, and look, it's pretty much impossible to get through an entire page of the Bible without God talking about lifting up the poor and taking care of the poor. And so, what folks did who were part of this movement is they looked at this and they said, well, look, God obviously cares about the poor. And so you can't have a spirituality that is not about lifting up and taking care of the poor. And so, yes, this very much has become aligned with leftist political thinking in many different contexts, but not only leftist thinking per se, but yeah, it certainly is very much one key doorway into all of this.
Just to go through a few of these comments, Ford writes a series of comments that kind of go in a direction. No gods, no masters is pretty clear. Could unpack these. God is dead, long live God. It's a whole death of God movement thing there that I'm not going to go into now. No gods, no masters, no markets. I'd be okay with market socialism, but yeah, definitely no capitalist markets. Mark writes, I strongly believe that spirituality is fundamental to all human beings, whether they are cognizant of it or not. I tend to agree. And so the question is, what does that mean? What does spirituality mean?
Yeah, I think we have to unpack what that means. And there is a little bit of a problem of, sort of labeling everyone with a certain thing that means something to me that somebody else says doesn't mean anything to them.
And then you say, no, yeah, it does.
Yeah, just a little caveat about that. But yeah, if we define spirituality as some kind of connection to something greater, yeah, I would tend to agree with that.
Ed writes, power from within. I mean, this is one of the tensions, I think, among progressives and leftists is I agree that there's a sense of that we turn inward to find God, but liberation theology, and this is a tension I see a lot within contemplative movements. Liberation of theology assumes that you encounter God primarily outside of you in solidarity, and that there's a fundamental way of perceiving reality that you cannot get, especially if you're a part of dominant society, apart from solidarity. So there's this outward turn, but it doesn't negate the inward one. It just says you can't just do this. And I feel like a lot of contemplative spirituality just does this and says, if you do it right, then automatically you start noticing poor people. I'm like, that's not, I've known enough contemplatives who don't notice poor people to know better than that.
Yeah, and that's especially true in the white upper middle class world. And one of the things we were talking about before we started, is Boulder, Colorado, which is kind of the heartbeat of the ground zero of the New Age contemplative movement, and is unbelievably politically conservative in a lot of ways. I mean, they don't think they are. They think they're super liberal and groovy, but they're like NIMBY cubed in terms of their attitude of being open to people who are not groovy and white and wealthy. So yeah, contemplative spirituality does not necessarily get you to paying attention to justice.
Yep.
Timothy.
I'm happy to hear liberation theology being talked about again. It was so disappointing when John Paul II kept the legs from it. This is true. So we're talking about Latin American liberation theology had its heyday in pretty much the 70s.
70s and 80s.
And into the 80s, and then it dissipated. And then there was the only time you'd see theological papers about liberation theology, in the 90s and early thousands, was people talking about how it was dead. And then Pope Francis came along and revitalized that conversation among Latin American liberation theologians. In the meantime, there were feminist theologies, black theologies, womanist theologies. Those continue, but they are and they're liberationists, but they don't flow out necessarily of Latin American liberation theology, although there's a link there. And so now we're having a second revitalization, especially as people begin to confront more and more again the nature of imperialism. So it's a good time for this kind of flavor of theology. And Max brings up a good part of this, but a challenge for the left of liberation theology in both Black, U.S. Latin, liberation theology and Latin American is still a vein of God's sovereignty, king language. Appreciate feminist women's critiques of that language. To me, this is the best of liberation theologies. It keeps circling around and engaging itself so that we begin to uproot the ways that oppression finds its way into our imagination. And so liberation theology is a living, breathing thing. It didn't end in Latin America in the 70s.
No. And one of the things that's important for us to note about this conversation very explicitly, and we talked about this yesterday, right, is that the problem with this entire conversation in America is that there really is not a robust, serious, widespread, functioning leftist political movement in the United States. And so a lot of times when we think about spirituality in the left in America, we're talking about, liberal churches or, right, sojourners or, that whole realm of things, which definitely, they want to connect their faith to politics, but it generally is not leftist politics. But in America, we think it is because there isn't really a left. There's just a center and a right.
No, and this is there's this awkwardness around it too in the United States. There's a couple of things that make it difficult. One is the American political imagination, but also spiritual imaginations. We have a strong individualistic Protestantism as the primary lens by which we not only understand spirituality, but also politics. It's very huge in our imagination. And then we also have the shame of people that are not evangelical of apocalyptic spirituality because it's been dictated to us as the sort of left behind spirituality. So then when we go and read history and we see that a lot of leftist or radical movements have been apocalyptic, we just don't even want to touch it. And to me, like, people can disagree with this if they want. I don't think we're going to get a strong, robust leftist spirituality unless we can recover apocalypticism in some sort of healthy way. And that's not going to come anytime soon, the way it looks like it.
Well, although we started transmission by talking a lot about, the pandemic being apocalyptic, right? And that, just this unveiling of things. And, and climate change is very apocalyptic. And I think if people haven't gotten that yet, right, between the pandemic, hurricanes, double hurricanes, fires, jumping worms, killer hornets, all of these things, it's getting pretty apocalyptic. And I think it's only going to increase and continue. So,
that connects with Ed's comment real quick. I would argue that creation spirituality is necessary as well. I think that connects with the way you're saying. Dan has a new book coming out. If you want to make a plug. Dan.
Yes, called Creation's Wisdom, and it's spirituality and climate change, and really talks about a lot of these issues that we're discussing right now.
Mm-hmm. Julia writes, ashamed of my white trash upbringing, I tried mightily to assimilate to middle class and moved into a leftist household in South Minneapolis. Shay's sister Celia came to stay with us. Didn't like any of the people living there, but preferred my company. The dawn of enlightenment on how classism runs in the left as she schooled me good. I didn't know who her brother was at the time. Wow, that's a story.
Yeah, okay.
There's so much there, but yes, there's part of the challenge with leftism in America in general, and then also the way that spirituality is done is it skews towards the middle class and the highly educated
upper middle class.
Formally educated. And so to me, good leftist radical movements come from the people. Right. And so when all of a sudden you start expecting the people to have a certain rarefied lingo and analysis that's based upon having to have read Communist Manifesto, it's untenable. And in other countries, they have leftist movements that are peasant and worker movements. Yeah. Here, leftism tends to be driven, unfortunately, a lot more by quasi-academic folks, and there's reasons for that. It's not like I have a murky background, but I'm a highly educated leftist, so that fits me too.
Yeah. Well, and the origin of liberation theology were peasant-run Bible studies. Right? I mean, that was basically how it got going, where these, peasants would get together at night and read the Bible, and they started going, wow, like we're in the Bible and God likes us. And so, yeah, I mean, that sort of deep reflection, and some of the movements that Mark is talking about, way before you had the idea of left and right in politics. Yeah, we're all lower class peasant reject movements, and people who were the oppressed and marginalized groups who started getting together and reflecting deeply on their life and spirituality, and recognizing that God was interested in them, and that's a very powerful process. But yeah, that tends to not happen all that much in this country.
No, and this is just to triple underline this. If, as a leftist who's like maybe educated, your assumption is you have to enlighten lower class folks so they can be part of the revolution, you're doing it wrong. This part of the understanding of the option for the poor, but then also radical traditions, is you have to believe that there's a wisdom among the oppressed that you lack and that you're trying to be in solidarity with. This is part of like getting back to the creation. This is one of the dangers of environmentalism, is because it's easy, since trees don't speak, at least in ways that we usually can hear, it's easy to use those sorts of movements as a way just to insert your own will. So there's been a critique by a lot of people of color, that there's a reason white people really like environmentalism. It's not just because they care about the earth, but allows them to, you can insert your own voice into it. And so like
I keep seeing the ants now. I would just like
well, we have to care about the environment, but the truth is we have to assume that our white thinking gets in the way of that. And so this is why it's really important that people that say we need to center our solidarity on indigenous struggles against economic and ecological oppression. And, it gets really deep. So then what does spirituality look like that enables and empowers that?
Yeah.
Max writes, I do wonder if monotheism is always treated by monarchy and authoritarianism, threatened by monarchy and authoritarianism, even for the most radical of us. I think there's something to that.
We missed a couple.
Where?
We missed a couple comments.
Oh, there we go.
This one.
From Kathleen. The message of God's preference for the poor sometimes gets corrupted, as God wants some people to be poor. Yes.
Yeah. That's a problem.
There's a sentimentalizing of the poor, where somehow like we're not taking their struggle seriously, but thinking that there's a lot of condescension.
Yeah,
it comes
and go on. We talked about that in our episode about mission trips and things.
Yeah, going on to Ford writes, I affirm and share those fears. Chain of being theology leads to earthly hierarchies, it seems. This is the thing. Like if we assume that God is like the top of a power pyramid, and then below that you have kings, and then on the bottom are like peasants, you're going to have a bad theology personally. If you assume that God is the base, and then you have the oppressed above that, and on the top you have empire, then your theology is going to be better. And so you have to have a bottom up, where God's power comes from the roots rather than coming from the top down, like he's a sky god. Patricia writes, problem of making inside and outside a duality, both part of wholeness and fullness of living. NIMBY cubed, spiritual, but get the F off my lawn.
Yep.
That's well said. Yep. Well, there's a lot of comments here.
There's a lot of comments.
I think part of spirituality on the left is a contestation struggle between left politics and conservative ideologies, theologies. Yes, and part of the problem is the dominant centers of spiritual authority and teaching tend to be conservative. And so on the left, we have double work to do. We have to challenge oppression and also create our own systems and ways of doing theology and thinking. And that's a lot of work when you're also tend to be less resourced.
Yeah, although there are a lot of resources for that, the problem is that the church and religion tends to bury them because those critique religion, right? And this kind of goes back to the earlier comment of Adam about Jesus being an anarchist. I mean, what Jesus was doing, I mean, the Jesus movement was an intra-religious struggle. I mean, there were many, many people in Jesus's time that rejected the rule of the temple in Jerusalem, saw it as incredibly oppressive and authoritarian, and in league with the Romans and Herod, and were very much anti-temple religion. And Jesus was one of those people. And basically, he was saying, look, you're not caring for the poor, and all your rules and regulations just serve to crush the poor, not to lift them up. Mm-hmm. And, I am working against this. And so, that's where a lot of this liberationist impulse comes from, is looking at the power dynamics of Jesus's time and what were the arguments that he was really having with these temple authorities. And Christianity projects back and sees this as like Christianity versus Judaism. And that's not only incredibly anti-Semitic, but completely incorrect. Jesus was arguing with his own people and with his own religion. And this is the thing about spirituality and leftism, is that in many ways, it's that same impulse to reclaim spirituality for the people and not for the oppressors.
Liberation theology flows out of creation spirituality. I wouldn't say, well, what spirituality is so complex, like that, I don't want to be prescriptive at all because everyone has their own special way. But my general sense is all deep spirituality, if you're coming from a place of whiteness in particular, has to be filtered first through a theology of liberation, because otherwise you're not even able to perceive creation. I generally think we have to anchor our work in liberation thinking and primarily through relationships. If we just jump to creation spirituality, it just creates too big of a pocket for self-deception to where like all of a sudden we know better. Yeah. And I say that because I see a lot of that. I just see a lot of that.
Yeah.
But there's no silver bullet. It's not like if you read up on some John Sabrino, you're going to be set. Like it's
So we're over time. We got 1 million comments. So
just blaze through them.
Let's see if we can blaze through them without commenting. It's so hard for us to do.
Yes,
I think we can do it.
Are there people in liberation theology around that intersect with the climate crisis? Leonardo Boff is like one of the old timers who's doing that. Yeah. So I would start there. Leonardo Boff. We need uniforms like yellow vests, but with rainbows and unicorns to unify around. Forward. You got a lot in you. Imagine rainbow-clad unicorns running toward you with Molotov cocktails. That's the John Lennon song I want. I don't know, he's writing music anymore. Apocalyptic for sure. Ceres writes, there's not much actual progressive and leftist politics. Plus, a lot of actual leftists in the U.S. are spiritually and culturally imperialistic, often hiding that in scientific rationalism. Amen.
Ooh,
there's a lot in there. Very good comment.
Serious. Throwing down again.
Brennan has a link to Eco-Liberation New Paradigm.
Cool.
I don't know if that's the Boff book or it's another one, but yeah, go to that link and then look around from there. There's some good stuff out there. Truth But Said, Brendan Johnson. I don't know.
Thank you for something.
Okay.
For the link. Okay.
And don't forget the apocalyptic.
Oh, thank you, Julia. Yes, the robot birds are totally connected with all of this, of course.
Paternalists of the world unite. Thank you, Mark. Say that. I don't know what it was. Also,
you've been saying so many good things.
Applies to everything, I'm assuming.
Yes, you always say so many good things.
Thank you too, Dan. Being self-employed and cyclically broke has done more for my spirituality and compassion than any contemplative education. This is why it's so complex. The Spirit is all over the place with people, so we can't just be too prescriptive about this. This is why mysticism is so important. It allows people to perceive the word. I'd love to hear more about that if we had time. The poor are the noble savages of the 21st century. We have to really interrogate our condescensions a lot, and that's part of the work. Think about white-led activist movements, often taking center stage in struggles that are not their own. True.
Amen.
Occupy showing up and getting in front of the camera and whatnot. Yeah.
Talked a lot about that. We're talking about the corner where George Floyd was killed.
There's not division between creation and the poor. No, but there's division between the poor and people who are not poor. And so we have to think about how we do our spirituality in a way that doesn't create weak spots. I want stories about femme ants that survive Mordor. The so-called ant wives, like we know. That's one of the great mysteries. Your critique of environmentalism is also a reason that children are a useful thing to bludgeon things with. Yes, conservative politics will often refer to the children as like this basis by which they can do stuff. And on the left, we have our versions of that too. So it's not that children aren't important and the environment isn't. It's just we have to be aware of self-deception and our own tendencies to manipulate. Gregory writes, hierarchy itself is problematic. That's right. And it's more reflective of imperialism than it is of heart, design, and desire of God. Emmanuel, God with us, not above us or over us. Amen.
Amen.
It's well stated.
Thank you.
Gus, for example, you want people with a history of sexual crimes not to be castrated and shoved to live under a bridge. Won't you think of the children? Kids aren't speaking partners in our society. In the context of centering the people, that's why this trend of needing the right language to be woke or whatever gets in our way. It's true. It becomes about showing how radical you are instead of doing the actual work of movement building toward liberation. If we only have the right words, it sets up a trap into the abstract where we become useless.
Yeah, because ultimately, liberation and transformation is really about relationship, not about lingo. No.
And then I like the strong language of self-deception. I mean, to me, that's analysis of self-deception. Yeah, and this is, I feel like Dan talks about this a lot. Like this spiritual practice isn't foolproof or magical, but it's absolutely essential, or if we're going to be able to examine ourselves and how we're perceiving the world and be able to create a space where the Spirit of God can break through and open up real freedom to not be baked into the system. When was the last time you heard the word stewardship or sustainability?
Hear it all the time, but
maybe
you got some other thought about it. Yeah. Okay. Phew.
We did it.
Thank you for all the comments. Really great.
Really truly comments. Really good.
Yes, really good. And appreciate it so much. Appreciate all of you. And we will be back tomorrow for part 3.
What are we talking about tomorrow, Dan?
The left and violence. Everybody's favorite topic.
And this links directly with the previous 2.
With the spirituality piece.
Yeah.
So, see ya.
We'll see you tomorrow.
Thanks. Yeah.